We are a group of community leaders and activists formed specifically to help pass this important legislation. An important member of our coalition is Nica, the New England Chinese American Alliance, whose support and assistance, without which this forum would not have been possible. We would like all of the participants to include their affiliation, if relevant, in their name box, put us on speaker view, and use the Q&A for questions and the chat function for comments or other remarks. It is my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce Senator Jamie Eldridge. Senator Jamie Eldridge has served as a state senator for the Middlesex County, the Middlesex and Worcester districts since 2009, representing 14 communities in Metro West. He serves as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on the Judiciary and the Senate Vice Chair on the Joint Committee on Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture, and on the Senate Committee on Post-Audit and Oversight. As an activist legislator, Senator Eldridge is the Senate Chair of the Clean Energy, Criminal Justice Reform, Medicare for All, and MBTA caucuses. Senator Eldridge has focused his energies on Beacon Hill on increasing investments in public education and transportation, combating climate change, making healthcare a right, stimulating the economy, advocating for affordable housing, reforming our criminal justice system, advancing campaigns and ethics reform, protecting the environment, and supporting immigrants. He lives in Acton, his hometown. It is no surprise that Senator Eldridge once again is stepping forward to uplift the voices represented here. The senator is a legislator and public servant who hears all voices and centers all voices. He lifts as he rises, and he mentors as well as leads. So we thank Senator Eldridge for his generosity and big heart. And without further ado, he is going to introduce the subsequent speakers.
Great. Thank you so much, Vivian, for that very gracious introduction. Good evening, everyone. We have a record number of people signed in, I think around 200 people that RSVP'd for tonight's Anti-Racism, Equity, and Justice in K-12 Education Bills Forum. I'll be introducing them a little bit later, but I want to just extend a heartfelt thank you to Senator Jason Lewis and Representative Nica Elegardo, who have filed the legislation, which will be a main focus for today, Senate 365 and House Senate 584, to bring this kind of curriculum into our public schools. It is an honor to represent such a diverse district. I want to thank CARE for sponsoring tonight's forum, as well as NECA being so involved. And I will say a number of groups focused on racial justice and opposing racism have put a great amount of time into tonight's forum. So I really want to thank them for all their tremendous organizing and outreach. It's my pleasure to highlight that, you know, an important part of education, of course, is helping students identify their place in the world. And a great way to do this is to introduce materials that act as mirrors and windows. It's a very important thing to think about. A mirror is a story that reflects your own culture and helps you build your identity. A window is a resource that offers you a view into someone else's experience. Here to talk about the importance of mirrors and their absence in their education are 8 students from Mass Youth for CARE, the youth arm of the Coalition for Anti-Racism and Equity in Education, CARE. And it's my honor to introduce these students. And I would just add before I introduce them is that as someone who grew up in Acton and went through the Acton and Boxborough public schools, I want to be absolutely clear that I saw direct examples of racism against Asian American students, against Black students. I saw anti-Semitism, and we know in the Acton-Boxborough community, this continues. And when we're talking about all the different tools to combat racism, I think it's so important to remember that we need to include education in that. So with that, I'd like to introduce the students. We have Rebecca Zhang, Ariana Roberts, Sophia Zhang, and Olivia Lee, who are all from the Acton Boxborough Regional High School. We have Kitchali Flome from Malden High School. We have Jake Pettigrew, who is a Malden High graduate and entering as a freshman at the Tufts School of Engineering. Mandy Sun is from Boston Latin, and Lex Buffange is from Melrose High School. So thank you to the students, and looking forward to your comments.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Senator. So without further ado, let's get into it. My name is Jake Pettigrew. I am a member of the Care for Education Equity Youth Committee, and today we're going to be talking to you a little bit about care and why we're so passionate about pushing this bill and really furthering this cause. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Thank you for the introduction, Jake. I deeply appreciate everyone joining us here tonight. I want to give a special thanks to Senator Eldridge for organizing this event and providing a platform for us to voice our advocacy for the CARE bill. As Senator Eldridge noted, I'm with 7 other representatives from MA Youth for Care. We're a statewide group of student activists who work in support of progressive social change in education and legislature.
So the CARE bill has really strong support from Massachusetts youth. Some of the stakeholders and contributing organizations include Sociedad Latina, Diversify Our Narrative, the Greater Malden Asian American Community Coalition, the Malden Youth Leaders, the Boston Latin School Cultural Club Coalition, and Dear Asian Youth.
In the past 2 years, violence against minorities has gained attention on the national stage. In May 2020, George Floyd was brutally murdered by a police officer. In March 2021, 6 Asian women were killed in the Atlanta spa shootings. And since the pandemic began, more than 6,600 anti-Asian hate incidences have been reported.
We have to agree that these acts of discrimination and hate crimes are at an all-time high. And with a lack of legislation to protect us, they will unfortunately continue. Many of these interpersonal conflicts stem from a systemic long-term issue, our education. Hate and fear originate from ignorance and unfamiliarity, and the CARE bill aims to address that through a more diverse and anti-racist schooling. Now we're going to hear from tonight's student panelists to learn more about their experiences regarding social justice issues in education and the importance of diversity, representation, and racial justice training in schools. So our first question for today is, has your ethnicity been represented in your school's curriculum and how? So Ariana, why don't you go first?
So I'm half Chinese, and my Chinese ethnicity has really never been represented at all in the English curriculum. We never read books from any Chinese perspectives. And in the history curriculum, it's really only mentioned in regards to when we learn about China, and then we only learned that it's communist. So we never really learned about Chinese Americans except this year. And that was really only due to a really good teacher that I had who spent their own time and resources in developing this course. And I hear that other history classes in my grade weren't able to do this. And I think that's why the CARE bill is so important, because I think it's unreasonable to ask teachers to try to come up with this like very necessary lesson plans by spending a lot of their own time and resources to do this. And I think the CARE bill, like it would help actually provide resources for teachers. And when teachers don't teach about racism though, oftentimes, especially when something racist happens at school, they will make BIPOC students often have to educate the rest of the class about racism. And this is a lot of pressure, since I might not feel comfortable to show that vulnerability to the rest of the class oftentimes. And there's an unfair responsibility placed on BIPOC students to sort of have to represent their race. And but if we don't speak about it, nobody will really learn about it. For instance, there was this one time we were having a class discussion and the topic of mixed race came up. So I shared my experience about being mixed race, but because it was kind of the beginning of the year and I think it was only a month into school, I hadn't really connected with my classmates or my teacher yet to be able to comfortably share my experiences in depth. So I didn't delve too deeply into my experiences and actually got a lower grade in the discussion because of this. And my teacher commented that she wanted me to elaborate deeper into my experiences and say more. And in hindsight, this shouldn't have been an obligation for me. Just because I'm mixed race, I don't have a responsibility to teach the whole class about it. The teacher should be having that responsibility to teach about racism. And if teachers are given proper resources to teach about it, then a lot of this wouldn't fall on BIPOC students to have to do it.
So I go to the same school as Ariana, so I've had a lot of similar experiences with the lack of representation in the curriculum, particularly in elementary school for me. Specifically, I remember that we talked a lot about stereotyping and labels from a young age, and it was always a very important conversation, but we never really talked about it in the context of the model minority myth and the Asian American community. And when you combine that with the lack of representation and diversity in books, stereotypes can very easily take over. And I think in our district, there's this very intense pressure to fit into the smart Asian stereotype. And I think it's shocking because it starts from a young age. For me specifically, I was very quickly stereotyped as the quiet, smart Asian girl and nothing else. And I remember that people would literally take my tests away from me and they would look at my grades and share my grades. And then they would call me perfect and the smartest girl in the grade. And I think at the time I didn't realize that it was harmful, but in reality, it put so much pressure on me to be perfect just because of a stereotype. And I remember in like 5th grade, if I didn't get 100 on a test, I would get upset because I knew that everyone else expected me to do perfectly. And I would stay up until 1 a.m. to study for tests. And again, I was literally 10 years old and all of this was just incredibly unnecessary. And I just felt so much pressure to be perfect because of the stereotype. And I didn't even realize that. And I think that classmates and even teachers really pushed this stereotype onto me. And they didn't realize it either, because there was no education about harmful stereotypes like this. And there's no representation in English books showing that Asians are not a monolith. And even now, I think it sometimes gets a little hard to just be a human being outside of a stereotype, because there's simultaneous pressure to fit into the model minority myth, but also pressure to prove yourself different from the stereotype, because there's no education that shows that Asians can be and are different. And in general, it can just feel very suffocating. And I feel like representation and honestly just talking about the model minority myth from a young age would have helped so much. And so I think that the Care Bill specifically would help a lot because it does provide for ethnic studies in elementary school, and it pushes for anti-racist education from a young age, which is so incredibly important.
Wow, thank you so much, Ariana and Rebecca, for those profound answers. I bet a lot of people, including me, can definitely relate to the pressure of performing and representing your ethnicity. Our second question today is, how diverse is your school faculty? Do you feel represented? Lex, why don't you go first?
Hey, so for me, growing up in the Boston public school system, I never really had any difficulty trying to relate to my teachers because the majority of them were Black or people of color. And so having that connection to your educators really does a lot for you, knowing that they come from similar neighborhoods and share similar experiences. And, you know, growing up in an environment like that, you get to really discuss with your teachers what you want to hear in your curriculum, what kind of books you want to read. You get a lot more representation in education that really reflects you in history and literature. And there's a lot more freedom in the way you communicate with teachers who are, you know, similar to you in that way. And I remember I had one teacher who used Ice Cube lyrics as a way to lecture us about academic ambition, which I thought was really funny. But ever since I moved to the suburbs, this experience has kind of been flipped on its head. And there's that lack of relation to my teachers now that I go to a predominantly white school. And while I had the vast majority of my teachers were Black. Now, I don't think there's a single Black teacher at Melrose High School at the moment. And, from my experience having Black and brown teachers, I understand that they are able to relate to students of color in a way that, white teachers really just aren't unable to. And on top of this, when a racist incident does occur in the classroom, which, is pretty frequent if you're paying attention, white teachers aren't nearly as equipped to handle it appropriately, or at times even address or notice it. And so, clearly just it does a lot to have teachers in the environment that reflects you. I don't think that having a white English teacher spit Ice Cube lyrics at me would have the same positive effect, but yeah.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience as Lex living in the suburbs. So I really only had one Asian American teacher before, and that was my 11th grade English teacher. For me, and I'm sure for many of my Asian peers, she was a mentor to us. And for me, it was especially because she was so confident in her identity and she really knew who she was as a person. And that was something that I really wanted for myself because I was lacking it, and I really admired that in her. So by having her as my teacher and advisor of a club that I frequently attend, I was able to learn to embrace my identity more, which was such a positive experience. And I truly wish that I could have experienced something like this at an earlier age, especially when I was more impressionable. There were many times at school where I would have microaggressions against me because of my race, and I had a lot of internalized racism within my own system. And having some more positive role models who really represented my own identity as teachers would have been definitely so helpful for me to just become more confident in who I am as a person.
Wow, thank you so much, Lex and Olivia, for sharing your experiences. It's really interesting to compare these two learning environments and see how much they can influence students. Our third and final question for tonight is, how have teachers addressed racism and/or microaggressions? Ketchali, I hear you have an interesting experience about this.
Thank you. In my own experience in a history-based classroom, oftentimes discussions are brought up outside of the core objective about race. And a lot of microaggressions I see are sometimes as simple as a student defending the Confederate flag as Southern pride, or saying racial slurs because it's a trend, and teachers within those classrooms staying a silent bystander. The same teacher for me has also been known to use the expression sticks and stones excuse for people these days being too sensitive as a response to people standing up against being offended towards microaggressions in today's society. And this is detrimental because it encourages students to continue to stay silent, speaking up against microaggressions, and others to continue not to take those who do speak up seriously. And this is where the CARE bill comes in. It allows professional development to come in and teach teachers how to approach these microaggressions within the classroom, other than just winging it or staying a silent bias. Using expert research and proven methods would also help improve these environments for not only teachers, but for students as well. Thank you.
So clearly, given the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes and the various incidences of police brutality, learning about anti-racism in school is critical. However, without proper legislation, there is a lack of resources to teach anti-racism. As you've heard from the various experiences of our panelists, it is necessary to improve the education system in regards to teaching about racism and promoting equity within schools. Therefore, our group advocates for the CARE bill, or in other words, Bill S-365.
And that's it. We'd love if you guys could follow us on our social media platforms for any updates on events and updates on the bill and the progress. It will also kind of help us kind of gain steam and get our kind of advocacy going. And so we'd really appreciate if that was if you guys could do that. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at our email or at any of the social media platforms provided.
So thank you so much to all the students. Really powerful to talk about your personal experiences. Thank you so much for participating in tonight's forum. And note that those social media marks to follow. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jessica Boots, an educator and member of the board of directors of the MTA, the Mass Teachers Association, to talk about what happens when there are no windows to educate students and society in general. Jessica, thanks so much for being part of tonight's forum.
Thank you. First and foremost, I want to extend my thanks and my praise to Rebecca, Lex, Ariana, Sophie, Jake, and Ketchely, who have so eloquently expressed their truth, their need for anti-racist curriculum, and the need in this moment for mirrors in our curriculum. One thing I've learned in my time in education is that students are often our greatest and sharpest experts in the room. They're a wealth of knowledge, and when they talk and when they come together, it's our role as educators and in this public trust to listen. On the education side of things, I will speak as an educator with the Malden Public Schools and a member of the Massachusetts Teachers Association about the importance of curricular windows. And when I say windows, I mean curriculum that represents myriad perspectives or identities outside of what we might consider the norm. I have observed in my decade of working with English learners from all walks of life and many countries around the world that when we are silent on difference, that can become its own curriculum or a hidden curriculum, if you will. When curricular materials don't have representations of difference, or they represent difference poorly or in stereotypical ways, like some of the students had mentioned, or when school staff are taught to only diffuse or de-escalate rather than encourage meaningful student-driven conversation about difference, we implicitly teach our children that their difference or any difference at all is shameful. I'm going to say that again. When we are silent on difference, when we do not provide those different experiences or windows into other worlds and identities, what we are often saying or implicitly telling children and young people is that that difference is shameful. And this shame has impacts beyond self-esteem alone, right? I think we often talk about the emotional impact, but there's also a tangible impact on students' outcomes. We can see research has shown us that there is a tangible connection to worse academic outcomes such as grades, even horrible things like retention or dropping out of school, when students aren't provided a wealth of these windows to the multiple viewpoints, identities, and experiences that they're going to encounter in our world. That is why it is so important for Massachusetts curricular materials to provide windows to the world around us, and for educators who understand the day-to-day challenges of schooling to provide meaningful perspective and advice. Cultivating curriculum intentionally to include these windows moments is key. And unfortunately, with all of the competing demands that educators have, we're busier than ever. This can get overlooked when we're not intentional and thoughtful and when we're not provided resources and support. What I love about the bill that we are here to discuss today is that not only does it provide time and intention, but it also provides funding and support so that schools can engage in this anti-racist, culturally responsive work intentionally and well. Thank you very much.
Jessica, thank you so much. Really appreciate being part of this forum and raising up those issues related to curriculum. So thanks so much for being here. It's my pleasure now to move to the second part of the forum, presentation by legislators with Senator Jason Lewis and Representative Nica Elegardo. Before I introduce them, I just want to highlight that I'm hosting this forum because of the absence of those mirrors and windows that affect my constituents. And I do believe that the legislation that's been filed, Senate 365, House 584, addresses that vacuum. This bill is really an example of a grassroots effort. It was proposed in response to the accounts and experience of students, teachers, community leaders, and organizations, both inside and outside my district, that people of color are underrepresented and underserved in curriculum, pedagogy, and educational practices in our public schools. My constituents and all Massachusetts residents have been affected by the events of 2020, including the murder of George Floyd and the ongoing challenges of 2021. This legislation, an act relative to anti-racism, equity, and justice in education, filed by Senator Jason Lewis and Representatives Nica Elegardo and Representative Erica Eiderhaven, is very important because education will provide for learning and recognize the history, culture, and contributions of all of our ethnic groups. And I think this bill represents a critical first step in perfecting our union, in ensuring and really strengthening our democracy. And again, I know that there's a lot of legislation out there filed to tackle racism, to address racial injustice. And it's so important through this forum, but after the forum, make the education curriculum is really critical as well to get to the root of the problem. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleagues, Senator Jason Lewis and Representative Nica Elegardo, to discuss the nuts and bolts of this important legislation that they've introduced. So this is the first session the bill's been introduced. There will be Q&A from the audience at the very end, and so please put those in the chats. For Senator Lewis, he represents the people of the 5th Middlesex District of Massachusetts. First elected to the Senate, he has delivered results for his district and has been being a true progressive leader for the Commonwealth. And hopefully, as most people know, he has long championed education equity and led the fight to pass the Student Opportunity Act in 2019, landmark legislation to ensure that every child in Massachusetts has access to a high quality public education. And Representative Nica Elegardo has over 25 years of experience in community and economic development with public, private, and nonprofit leaders, especially in BIPOC communities. And she represents the 15th Suffolk District, including the communities of Brookline, Jamaica Plain, Mission Hill, and Roslindale. And as a state rep, she continues her mission to expand the power and voice of people historically marginalized, from incarcerated activists to public housing residents to immigrant and BIPOC leaders. Thank you both, and looking forward to talking about your legislation.
Thank you so much, Senator Eldridge. It's just such a pleasure to be with you and Representative Elegardo and such an amazing group of advocates and activists, and particularly the inspiring students that are with us and that we heard from earlier this evening. Thank you, Senator Eldridge, for really bringing us all together. I feel so fortunate to serve in the Senate with you, and in many ways, you've been a role model and a mentor for me with the amazing social justice, economic justice, environmental justice, and racial justice work that you've long championed. I also want to give a particular shout out to my constituent and friend Maidu and the Greater Malden Asian American Community Coalition. And it really is not, it is not an overstatement to say that if it were not for Mai's passion and just kind of amazing coalition building skills and grassroots advocacy, we really wouldn't have this legislation that we're talking about tonight. So before I get into the details of the bill, let me just take a quick step back. And Senator Eldridge mentioned the Student Opportunity Act, but I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that. But that was really landmark legislation that passed in late 2019. And it was the culmination of many years of work by so many people in the education community to ensure that we truly have equitable funding for our public schools. And with the passage of that legislation and with the implementation of that over the coming years, that's going to be a game changer for ensuring that our school districts that serve large numbers of disadvantaged students. These are particularly students that come from low-income families, students of color, students who don't speak English as their first language, have special needs, and so on. That the schools and the districts that largely serve these students will finally have the resources that they need to provide the high quality education that these students deserve. So that really, I believe, with this new funding formula, really will be leading the nation in this progressive approach to how to fund public schools. So that's going to be rolling out, in the coming years, and that's going to certainly be important in providing more resources for a variety of important initiatives that our schools need to undertake to support all students, particularly those who are the most disadvantaged. So I see this work in terms of anti-racism and racial justice in our schools as building on the Student Opportunity Act, again, that we passed a few years ago. So how this came about was, again, with the coalition building and the advocacy of MyDo and other advocacy groups. We kind of came together over a year ago and started looking at different examples and initiatives that could really, in a meaningful way, advance, anti-racism and ethnic studies in all of our public schools. So we looked at what other states, have been doing, certainly California, but a number of other states. We looked at efforts underway in some of our own school districts. We looked at what our state department, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, has been doing, because there are some good initiatives that they've been pursuing in this area. And looked at also other legislation that we had passed in recent years that we thought could serve as a good model. For example, back in 2018, the legislature passed an important bill to support civics education in our schools. So I mention that all because that's sort of the context around and the research that we did to craft this bill. A lot of thought, went into it, even though it's a brand new bill that Senator Eldridge says is being filed for the first time. So the bill really has two main components to it. The first is that it will create a standing permanent commission, and that will be the Anti-Racism and Equity and Justice in Education Commission. As some of you may know, we have some other commissions like our Asian American Commission, Commission on the Status of Women. So we have some other examples, but this commission would be dedicated to pursuing and furthering these efforts in our schools. We've done some thought about, put some thinking into what the appropriate composition of the commission will be. And so we really wanted to reflect the different, racial and ethnic groups in the Commonwealth that would be centered in the makeup of this commission, as well as stakeholders who understand so well what needs to happen in our schools, like our teacher unions and our superintendents and so forth. What the commission will do is a number of very important things. First, they will be helping to develop curricular materials, that will be focused on dismantling racism in our schools. So there is a lot of good work happening already here and around the country. There are some good materials that have been and are being developed, and the commission will bring those forward and into our support bringing them into our schools. They'll also work to ensure that ethnic studies and racial justice permeates our curriculum and our culture in our public schools at all grade levels. Obviously, it needs to be age appropriate for different students at different grades, but making sure that is included across the board. They will, another important role that they will have is to advise and work with our Department of Education on efforts to diversify our educator workforce. That's a key part of this, of what we need to do. We have, over 40% of our students, our public school students, who are students of color in Massachusetts. And the percentage of educators of color is less than 10%. So there's a huge disparity there. And as I think was mentioned earlier, there's extensive research that shows that students of color who have just one teacher of color during their years in school leads to a whole range of positive outcomes. So that's going to be an important role for this commission. And then lastly, they will be working on efforts to support professional development and training for our educators and administrators in order to do this important work, as that is another need, as was mentioned by our students earlier. So that's the first part of the bill. Just quickly to because I'm going to run out of time here and I want to leave enough time for Representative Elegardo. The second part is we will create a grant fund so that the commission, in partnership with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, is able to make grants directly to schools, to districts, to community-based organizations, and to higher educational institutions to do this important work, to develop the curriculum materials, to do the training, the professional development, and the work we need to do to diversify our educator workforce. So we think that's a powerful combination, and that's why both elements are included in this bill. I do want to give a shout out to a lot of great work that is happening already in a number of our school districts. And we think that this bill, by passing this bill, it will help to accelerate and expand those efforts and also to broaden them across, all of our school districts. In conclusion, the last thing I want to mention is also, I just want to make sure that on your radar is the Educator Diversity Act, which is essentially a companion piece of legislation that I have partnered with Latinos for Education and another coalition to file. And that bill would also implement a variety of strategies that would help diversify our educator workforce. So my hope this session is that we will pass this bill and also the Educator Diversity Act, and that would be tremendous for our pursuing our racial justice efforts in public education. So thanks for the opportunity to be with you this evening, and really excited to work together in the months ahead.
I go, Nica? Okay. Thank you so much, Jason, for laying out the bill. And I want to also thank my good friend from a long time, even before I was an elected official, Senator Eldridge, not only for hosting us, but for modeling what it looks like to lead in a delegation where you have so many representatives who look to each other and to you to understand the needs of the district. And I'll talk about how the youth on the call can use that model in other parts of the state towards the end of my comments. Thanks, Vivian, it's so good to see you again. We got to quit meeting this way though, but you're a wonderful moderator. But I especially want to thank the youth in the coalition because this bill is very personal to me. And I'm grateful to Senator Lewis and to you all, youth leaders and your coalition allies, for inviting me to come on to a bill that was so well written and so inspiring. I went to 8 different public schools myself before landing in a private school in the 8th grade. And I had a number of experiences that really caused me to resonate with some of the comments that the youth made. I remember in the 11th grade when my trigonometry professor told me, go and get the application to take the Math Level 2 exam, which at that time was the highest exam for math that you take as part of your college entrance. And I went to our guidance counselor and asked for that exam prep and for the application because we didn't have internet yet, right? This is like, I don't know, 1990 or something. And she said, the Math Level 2 exam is going to be a waste of your time. And so I'm not going to waste my time giving you the application, which was going to take literally 45 seconds of her time to get that out of her file and hand it to me. And I said, what makes you say that? My trigonometry professor thinks that it's going to be a good use of my time. And she said, we both know you're not going to get into any school that requires a Math Level 2 exam. And fortunately, I knew myself and I knew who I was and I knew what I was capable of. And so I said to her, if you don't give me the application, I'm going to search your office until I find it. And that's what I had to do. I put everything back exactly as I had found it. I did it right in front of her. I got that application. I aced that exam and I got into MIT and Columbia, to name a couple of the schools, Princeton, and I wasn't denied any entrance to anywhere. So not only was it wrong for her to say that to any student, it was a lie in my case. And that was actually the first day she had met me. She'd never reached out to me as a guidance counselor. When I was a freshman at that same school, a first year, I was so blown away by the education because I hadn't been to very high quality schools before. And I was in my first year of French and I was already able to speak full sentences. I couldn't believe it. And so I said to my French professor, as I'm just looking out at these, we literally had ivy covered brick walls in this building in the middle of urban Columbus where I grew up. And I said in French, wow, the education here is amazing. The kids in my neighborhood all deserve this kind of an education. I was the only person of color in my class. And she said to me in French, the kids in your neighborhood would ruin this school.
God.
And I said to her in French, I'm the only kid from my neighborhood you've ever met. Am I ruining this school? And then she said something I didn't understand in French, but it wasn't good. I was in big trouble. And she was angry at me for defending the truth and for defending the justice of education for all. It was those experiences and some other experiences that I had with children who were being educated, particularly Black boys in schools where they weren't getting treated much worse than I was in this fancy private school, and not even being educated, being promoted without knowing how to read. And I'm tutoring kids in math who don't know how to read, but they're passing every grade. And I remember spending a lot of time on the phone, payphones in those days, trying to figure out who at the Department of Education I needed to talk to fix these problems, getting put on hold as a 15-year-old activist like yourselves. And there were no voicemails back then. You got like little answering machines. You had to keep calling back, and there were no cell phones. And at some point I thought, I'm gonna have to go into this world and do it myself, because I feel like these people don't care enough. And the ones that do care seem to feel hopeless instead of doing something about it. So it is a very personal bill for me, because the reason that I had that sense in myself is because my grandmother worked at the Martin Luther King Library, where I spent a lot of my time learning about my people and culture and other cultures. My parents sent me when I was 7 and 8 years old to summer school at Arambe Aruhu Academy, where you learn Afrocentric education, African history, and the history of other BIPOC people in America. So by the time I had those encounters, I already knew who I was. I had experienced the curriculum, but not at school. And so I personally understand the power of having knowledge about your own self and history. But how much more powerful is it when the people that are talking to you, instead of tearing you down and trying to prevent you from achieving your potential and your dreams, actually understand how to build you up and lift you up using the history and the present work of people of color and BIPOC people to build this country and to build your community, to teach you how to be your best version of yourself. Integration, which you all know about the civil rights movement, integration was actually really hard on my family. As was mentioned by several people, the educators being BIPOC people matters a lot. Not just what's in their mind and their head, but what's in their life experiences also matters a lot. And my family members and all 4 of my grandparents come from the South, from communities that were all Black, except for my one grandfather from Kentucky, who's like half white, actually comes from a white community in the Appalachians. But on the other 3 sides, we have lawyers in my 2 or 3 generations back, doctors, teachers, librarians, and they were poor because they worked in Black communities where people couldn't pay them, accountants, but they were educated. When integration happened, the racism was so oppressive and so challenging for my family members that our college attainment rate actually dropped significantly for a whole generation. And both of my parents actually didn't finish college until I was in my 30s. And both of them got GEDs instead of finishing high school. And both of them were active, but not necessarily in the most productive ways during the civil rights movement. And both of them were angry about the ways and vocal about the ways that racism was oppressing them, and it wasn't being represented in their schools. In fact, racism was being represented in their schools and white supremacy. And so it took us a couple of generations to get back to a point where we're getting educated again as a standard versus as an anomaly. And one of the things that I know from that life experience is that curriculum isn't just the words on the page. It's about having a deep understanding of how to partner with each other and how to help us succeed and how to help us promote opportunity and justice for all. We have, I've heard a story recently of some teachers that went down to the African American Museum, which is really powerful in Washington, DC. It's the only time I've ever cried at a museum. And those teachers came back not only in ways where they were edified, but their students felt understood. And I heard some of the students talking in a news program that was showing this. Their students felt understood and empowered by the fact that their teachers could understand what they had been through in a new and special way. And that was just from a 2-day visit to a museum. Imagine when the teachers are deeply trained and when we have a commission who's responsible for making sure that this training is deeply integrated. I think I need to transition. Vivian's telling me to how do we get it passed? All right, I think I can share my screen, which I'm going to try to do here. Because I want you all to be familiar. Some of you will have seen this. Some of you were with me before. This is the legislativemap.org, legmap.org. And as you can see, I've highlighted here Senator Eldridge's district, which is drawn in blue. And Senator Eldridge has a delegation. A delegation means people that all have something in common. So what they have in common here is that they share a senator. So you can see Representative Dykema is in the south. And up here, if you click in the north, you can see Representative Sena. And you can click and find for each senator who are all of the representatives in their delegation. So what I would recommend that you do is that you use the model that Jamie Eldridge has presented here. And you have colleagues in your coalition all across the Commonwealth. And they have senators. And you should reach out to those senators and say, help us educate your delegation about this bill. All right. Now, another thing you want to know is who are the decision makers on the bill at any given time. Oh, that's another bill. Sorry, guys. I got a lot going on here. Here we are. Here's our bill. So if you go to malegislature.gov, you probably know that you can just type in the name of the bill in the search and it'll pop up. And there's myself and Representative Eiderhoven, who have filed this bill together. But you can also click on the Joint Committee on Education. And you can see who are the members. And you want to make sure that you're reaching out to all of those members, because at some point in the fall, this bill is going to come forward for a hearing, and you're all going to testify at that hearing. But when you testify, you don't want that to be the first time that these members have heard about the bill. Now, when you're talking to members of the committee before they've heard about the bill, you're not necessarily asking them with the same kind of passion that you are when they have a deadline in front of them, because legislators are much like students in that we work hardest on the things that we have a deadline for, right? And I've done a lot of school, and so I know how that works. And it's really similar as a legislator. So imagine if you have a final exam coming up 3 months from now, and one of your colleagues, one of your peers is asking you about a question on the final exam when you have a different test entirely that's tomorrow. So that's how you want to understand the legislators. They have things they're thinking about that are today, due, and then things that are in the future. So things that are in the future, legislators want to learn about them. They want to understand the pros and cons, and they want to know who in their district cares about it. And so that's what you're going to be trying to show them when you email them, when you call them. Of course, you want to say your story and share stories like we've shared today of why this is so important and so powerful. But you also want to ask them questions that engage them. Have you ever had experiences like this? Have you heard of anything like this from your other constituents? You want to get these legislators thinking. And then at the end, you always want to make an ask. And at this phase, the ask is, we hope you will sign on and support the bill. And actually, many of the people on this committee have done so. But you want to say, we hope you'll sign on and support the bill. But we also hope that you'll tell the chair and the vice chair that you would like this bill to be reported out favorably. So that's the phrasing. Some of you already know, you all need to learn that phrase. Please report this bill out favorably. If you have any questions about the bill, let me know and our coalition will get those answers to you. They're going to be super impressed by a 50-year-old that does that, but they're going to be super duper impressed by a 16-year-old that makes those statements to them. And the top thing you want to remember is it's not just important who you're talking to, but who is talking to them. Even though each of these people are on this committee, which is the Committee on Education, the Joint Committee on Education. And fortunately, we have the Senate Chair as one of the filers, so that's going to be a big bonus for us. They also are representatives of 40 to 45,000 people here. And what is it, senators, like 200,000 people that you guys represent or more? And so if you can bring people to talk to them or even to their staff, don't feel shunned when you're talking to staff. Staff are amazing. When you can send people to talk to them that come from their district, and how are you going to know that? Because you're going to look at the leg map, and then you're going to be able to say, okay, for this senator, we know people that live in this area. You can pop in addresses and everything like that. So there's a lot that you can do to make the groundwork strong, so that when the hearing happens, you want three things to have already taken place. You want legislators to have decided to come and testify at the hearing because they've heard from you. You want the members of the committee to have already heard from lots of constituents as well as other legislators. And you want the bill being reported out favorably to be the beginning and not the end of the bill. So I don't personally think we're going to have any trouble getting this bill reported out favorably. So some of the work that you're doing right now is to make sure that we can get a unanimous vote in the House and the Senate to get this bill over the line. Because as soon as the hearing happens, what you're going to start doing, and what Jason and Erica and I are going to start doing, we're going to start counting our votes. We're going to find out how many people have you told us, so please give us your reports when you have these conversations on what the legislators are saying to you. How many voters have you got? It's just like trying to win an election, but with a bill. And so you have a vote number that you need. You need 20 plus 1 in the Senate, 21 to get it passed. And you need 80 plus 1 in the House, because we have 160 people, that's 50% plus 1. But we want it to be veto proof, which is 107 in the House, okay? And we also want the governor to support it, and we want it to be unanimous. So you write down every single representative and every single Senate member in a spreadsheet. We can give you the spreadsheet, actually. And you want to check off how many you've talked to and whether they're supportive or not. And that way we can say to the Senate president and to the Speaker of the House, we already have the votes and we would like you to bring this to the floor for a vote. And as you know, the Speaker of the House, many of you know, is a former educator. And he's talked to me very many times about his memories educating young people and the pains in his heart about the inequities that they were experiencing. I think it was like 30 or 40 years ago. This is an argument that resonates with him, and he wants to help us. So make sure he knows how hard you've been working. Make sure we know how many senators and reps you've been talking to, so we can report that back to them. Oh, the coalition has talked to 86 representatives and senators, and they've all been favorable, right? That's as important as having those co-sponsors on the page, because they trust and believe us. So we're really proud of everybody on the call. We're really excited about your leadership. And I think we're really going to get this over the line, but I hope we can do it unanimously with your help.
Thank you, Nica, for giving us our marching orders. And thank you, Jamie and Jason and Nica again for teaching us so much. I would like to turn over now to Mona Roy, another chair member. She will moderate the ensuing panel of various esteemed educators and community leaders. Mona?
Yes, hello. One moment, please. Hello. Welcome everyone to the second portion of our evening. I would like to thank our legislators for providing us with some of the nuts and bolts of legislation. And now we have a panel ready to we have a panel ready to go of experts that can talk a little bit more about the science behind. The first, we have Dr. Paul Watanabe, Director of the Institute of Asian American Studies and Professor of Political Science at UMass Boston. We have NAACP Youth Coordinator, Aaron Olapate. We have back with us the really wonderful from MTA, Jessica Gold-Boots. And last but not least, we have Dr. Cedric Woods, Director of the UMass Boston Institute for New England Native American Studies. And so I would like to turn it over to Dr. Watanabe to introduce himself and also share why this bill is so important to him and how it affects his community. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want
Can I
thank you
ask that
very
you
much.
turn on the video? Sorry, this is the shot. Can I ask that the speaker turn on their video? Because
My video is on.
okay, great. All right, I see it now. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for everybody. And I feel a little sheepish when they mention with how people listen to the youth and how 50-year-olds sometimes don't get listened to. What about a 70-year-old like myself? So if you want to run and go to the bathroom or something while the 70-year-old speaks, it might be a good time. But let me tell you, I want to bring three perspectives to this work that I often utilize in approaching these subjects. And they're part of my identity in the way they are the part of me as an activist, as an educator, and as a person of color, specifically as an Asian American. As an activist, the way in which we approach issues is very clear. If we see a problem, we want to see how to address it and how to respond to it. And assuredly, we know that there is a problem in this country with racism. We've seen clear examples of this, whether from Ferguson, Missouri, to Minneapolis, to Atlanta, to Kenosha, Wisconsin, to examples here in Massachusetts, of the continuing problems that this country has with issues around racism. So racism is a problem. And assuredly, there are too many inequities that persist, and racial justice and justice in general is something that we always still strive for. It's something we want, but we need to strive for. And so as an activist, I see this as an issue, as a problem, and the question is, how do you address it? And there's where my notion of being an educator comes in. Education is a response to this, as it is to so many problems. It's not the only response. And there are many responses that are constructive and destructive. You know, there are people who think that the January 16th attack on the Capitol was a legitimate response to what they saw as a problem within the country. Well, to me, as an educator, I must say that education is an important response, and that's one that I think that we would need to support. It is based on the belief that knowledge can respond to ignorance, and that careful and critical and often difficult inquiry can contribute to change, individual change and institutional change. That's what education is about, and that's really what we're calling for. And finally, let me say, as a person of color, I've been asked to speak on these issues many times. For 40 years, really, as an Asian American, I've been asked to address these issues about what is the status of the Asian American community within the United States. And I believe that as a racial group, probably less is known about Asian Americans than any other group. But in the last month or so, since the Atlanta shootings, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, I think more Americans, by paying attention to what's happened to Asian Americans, have probably learned more about the Asian American experience in the last month than they had in the previous 200 years almost of our history of our country. That's the power of knowledge. That's the power of education to hopefully change attitudes and change the reality that's confronting the people in the United States who call themselves Asian Americans and much more generally people of color. And so for me, the problem that he addressed in those 40 years of talking about these issues is fundamental. It's invisibility, it's erasure. It's the notion that dominant racialization, like mentioned by the students, the dominant racialization of Asian Americans as model minorities, or the even more pernicious one that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners. That these sorts of situations thrive in a situation when a community and a particular experience is perceived as invisible. And that's what that invisibility needs to be attacked. And so in conclusion, as an activist, I think much of my activism has to be focused in this case on passing this legislation. That education is an answer. It's a way to bring together the activist part of me, the education part of me, and a part of me as a person of color. For indeed, for all of us here in the United States, we need to acknowledge and to dismantle racism. in our institutions, and hopefully in the hearts and minds of our students who are indeed our future. There is a saying in Japanese which says, "Kodomo no tamini," it means for the sake of the children. For the sake of the children, let's pass this legislation because it's for their, not only for their sake, but our futures as well. Thank you very much. Oh, Aaron, sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Olapate. I am the youth coordinator for the Mystic Valley branch of the NAACP. I'm extremely excited to be here with you all tonight and cannot be more thankful that I have been included as a panelist for this event. So thank you. Just a little bit about me. I grew up in Medford, Massachusetts and graduated from Medford High School in 2018. Soon after, decided to take a gap year, and I worked for City Year Boston, a national education nonprofit aimed at providing support to high-need public school systems around the country and internationally. It was my responsibility to act as both a teacher's aide as well as a mentor to certain students who have been flagged by the school system as at risk for academic failure as well as eventual dropout risk. Currently, I'm a rising junior at Boston College studying both political science and international relations. While performing my duties as both a student and the youth coordinator for the NAACP, I act as a community liaison for the City of Medford's Health Department, outreaching to minority communities. This bill is important to me and the NAACP at large as it directly correlates with the type of work that I'm aiming at achieving right now. The bill aims at combating racial inequality, ensuring equity, and developing a core curriculum that will incorporate a social justice aspect never utilized in our schools to this day. It will not only analyze the standing social sciences and history curricula, but also amend them in such a way that feels appropriate for the times we live in now. If we are able to pass this legislation, it will be one of the first concrete steps in working to a more equitable society at every level. It allows for the input of experts, educators, and leaders in their fields that we know can and will offer the most thoughtful and collaborative approach to this matter. As someone who identifies as a person of color, this directly correlates with me and what I understand because I went to a school that was predominantly white with a majority of people who were people of color, but were added into the boxes of not being people of color. This directly affected the way that I was able to learn, incorporate information, and feel about myself, as I did not see representation at every level of adults, including teachers, administrators, and above. Thank you again for allowing me to speak with you all. I'm now going to pass the mic off to Miss Jessica Goldboots.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome and for your wonderful words. As I mentioned before, I'm an educator with the Malden Public Schools and a member of the MTA Board of Directors. As a member-driven organization, the Massachusetts Teachers Association does not just represent teachers. We also represent librarians, education support professionals, and school staff so that we can best serve Massachusetts' most valuable asset, which is our students. Educators across the state and students and their families across the state have told us loud and clear, our curriculum needs to be more diverse and inclusive, not tomorrow, not 5 years from now, but today. The moral imperative is clear in the wake of violence against Black and Brown youth, anti-Asian violence, anti-Semitism, violence and harm against our LGBTQ youth, and many more social ills. When preparing for today's panel, I thought a lot about the idea that is certainly not an original idea, but that you may have heard floating around, that if public school did not exist today, if the concept of public school was not here today, that anyone introducing it would face a serious uphill battle and public resistance, because we're really losing in our society the idea of a public good or a common good. And I take that very seriously as an educator, as one of the few meaningful opportunities in our society for a site where everyone comes together, school, and where we provide for the common good. This moral imperative here of creating a more diverse curriculum in our public schooling is really clear. We see in our classroom roles as teachers, ESPs, librarians, school staff, administrators, even the bus drivers, that students thrive and learn and grow with opportunities to explore and reflect upon difference in the world around them. I would like to respond to a point that I've seen floating around a little bit, that discussing these issues or improving our diversity in curriculum is somehow divisive, or it teaches kids to hate other kids or dislike other students, or brings people apart. What I'm happy to report in my decade of experience in education, and hopefully for a much longer time than this, is that actually the opposite is true. Rather than being divisive, what I have found when culturally responsive work is done really well is that it teaches students, yes, to see difference and think about difference, but also acknowledge and respect difference. And it gives our students a chance to unify as we learn empathy and consideration for others. Something that I think we could say is really lacking in the world around us right now. I have seen my English learners grow in their bonds with others, with students who don't look like them or think like them, when this work is done well, and form lasting friendships that you might not have expected if you lived in the world of stereotypes. If you look at this divided country, I think the need for this work is clear. Another way that this is really salient right now, and where I think that this is the moment, not tomorrow, not 5 years, is that we've been through a year of COVID-19 schooling, more than a year at this point. Educators are surveying the landscape, and what we're hearing at the MTA is that we really don't like the phrase back to normal, not because we don't want the pandemic to be over, but because normal was not working for so many of our students. We must interrogate what normal means and who is being served by that traditional way of doing things. Yet we also hear concerns from educators about more pressure as the demand adds up for students to cover content, concerns about funding. Too often we have seen these amazing education bills pass that, promise everything under the sun, but don't necessarily give us the funding and the time and support to execute these amazing promises. The strength of this bill, and why I so strongly believe in this bill and why the MTA supports this bill, is that it not only provides for a committee of leaders from all walks of life, but it also provides key recommendations on these issues and funding through a trust, so that schools can offer a broader curriculum, including ethnic studies, so we can have professional development, just so that we can get this training and support to do this really, really well. This bill represents an opportunity for leadership from different walks of life in our Commonwealth to come together. And I really hope that you listen to Representative Nica's call for action and support this bill. I am going to pass this along to Dr. Cedric Woods, Director of the UMass Boston Institute for New England Native American Studies, who will speak to the strength of this bill as well.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm Cedric Woods, a citizen of the Lumbee Indian Tribe of North Carolina and the director of the Institute for New England Native American Studies at UMass Boston. I've been a guest now for over 25 years of many different regional indigenous nations, including the Pequot, Mohegan, and now the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapaw. I'm very privileged to have worked with many Native nations across the region, and I'd love to see a bill like this exist in all of the New England states, as well as my home state. The mission of my institute is to connect regional Native tribes and communities with university innovation, education, and research, and I can't think of a better way to do this, such as S365. I have to support this. We have to support this. The purpose of this commission is to ensure equity, something that sorely is needed for Native youth and community members to be represented as whole human beings with the rich and vibrant history and present in their homelands and home waters. We want Indigenous peoples' experiences to be not just relegated to the dustbin of ancient history, but part of the vibrant and important social fabric that exists today in the Commonwealth. This bill critically connects the work of the Commission in collaboration with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. This will ensure consistency with frameworks, pedagogy, and the ongoing identification of appropriate educational resources that advance anti-racist teaching. I'm fond of saying that budgets are moral documents, and the creation of this trust fund underscores the point that the values are matched with the allocation of resources. My colleagues and I at UMass Boston already work in collaborative spaces with several school districts to improve the access of teachers to culturally responsive material and analyses of frameworks. We look forward via the mechanism of this bill to working with many others. I'm confident this type of measured strategic approach will lead to sustained momentum and resources to develop curriculum and teacher training that will best prepare our youth for the future as contributors to a more just society. Thank you very much for this time, and Mona, back to you.
Thank you so much for to all of you really for those those words, which really frame what we're about to talk about today. And so there are kind of four tenets of the bill that we're really looking at. And I wanted to start with Aaron, if I can get him on screen. Spotlight, there we go. Aaron, I'd like to start with you. An important tenet of the bill includes developing curriculum materials with a social justice perspective. Given that you're the NAACP, local NAACP's youth coordinator, not so long ago, a high school student yourself, and even still continuing as a student in college, I would love to hear your perspective on what you hear as a youth coordinator, your own perspective, and really wishes, and perhaps the collective yearning for a social justice perspective. I think we heard very powerfully from some of our youth, and I would love to extend that. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the question. I think as a younger person, it's incredibly difficult to come to terms with the kind of person that you are, who you've been, and who you're going to be. And I think it's like of the utmost importance to me and the NAACP to advocate for the younger generation that they continue to navigate the ever-changing kind of climate of our society today. I think this bill will highlight the importance of a diverse curriculum, as the standing one is severely lacking the representation of BIPOC individuals and communities. This type of lacking curricula can really be, harmful, as it does not include the youth of the, does not educate the youth of the incredibly diverse world we live in, as well as like the diversity of a human being as they are. I think, how can we continue to progress towards a more equitable society if we are unable to educate those who will be leading us? How can we continue to move forward if we refuse to move from where we are? Maintaining the status quo is synonymous, in my opinion, with going backwards. As of right now, my role at the NAACP has allowed me to strike up dialogue with those, including younger folks within the branch's reach, who wish to bolster a more honest conversation about our lacking education at every level, from elementary to secondary education to even graduate level programs. We're seeing more and more of a necessity to fight for real change in Massachusetts, but the need and support and consistency of advocacy is what will really make those legislations pass and real change occur. As mentioned earlier by our students' guests, we are at impasse in our community, in our state, and our nation, as we cannot come to terms with where we've come from, where we're going. And I think with the untimely murder of George Floyd, we've seen a boiling point of our society where the legitimate state of our union has been recognized. We cannot come to any form of bipartisan attempt at impactful systematic change. And if allowed to pass this legislation, it'll demand that we completely reevaluate our students' education, how they're being prepared for the world we are leaving them with.
Thank you, Aaron. I would like to pass it to Paul, because I would love to hear from a university professor standpoint. And before I pass it to you completely, I wanted to actually put in one of our audience questions, which is that one of our guests rightfully notes that Asian Americans are usually not perceived as true Americans. They're often viewed as invisible or permanent foreigners. How does this bill support combating those entrenched stereotypes? So as we're talking about curriculum, how do you envision that moving this forward? Thank you.
Well, that invisibility and that erasure and that understanding that Asian Americans, no matter whether you just arrived in this country recently or whether you trace your ancestry back 200 years, as Asian Americans have been in this country. If you think about even just in the Boston area, Boston Chinatown is almost 150 years old. We've had a presence here, we've been here a long time, but yet for many people, we're still tied to the country from which our ancestors came rather than the United States. So this perpetual foreigner notion is fundamental. And it's not just attitudinal, it's really been reflected in the laws and the ways in which our community has been treated. That's the way that we need to understand it. A lot of people have talked about the anti-Asian violence as a reflection of perpetual foreignness. And it's true, but this anti-Asian violence is only reflective of something that's been very much a part of the Asian American experience since the very beginning, literally since the first time that they tried to step on these shores. Asian Americans, for example, in this nation of immigrants, propose this notion that people from all over the world can come to the United States and build a nation and find a home here. Asian Americans from the very beginning could not come from other places of the world and become citizens. They were uniquely labeled as aliens and eligible for citizenship. I'm Japanese American, for example, and as a Japanese American, if I had come here as an immigrant, I could not have become a citizen of the United States. I could not have been ineligible as an immigrant to become a citizen of the United States until about the 1950s. So think about that. For the longest period of time that Asian Americans have been on our shores, they could not even come here and become citizens. This we have to understand, and these are the kinds of understandings I'm talking about when I say we need to understand this experience. It's just not a function of Donald Trump saying certain things or certain things. It's not. He certainly amplified these notions, but they've been long-standing and they've been here, and they've affected not only the way in which you're dealt with on an individual basis, which are very important, but they've been inculcated in our laws and political reality since the very beginning. And we have to understand this framework in order to understand our place within the society, I think.
Absolutely. And I would actually like to get Jessica's viewpoint as a teacher, if you could just briefly tag on to that, because I think both Aaron and Paul have really spoken to the effects, but from an educator perspective, what would you like to share with us?
Sure. What I would like to add is just that I think that we often talk about this issue in emotional terms, which is incredibly important, right? If we have students who do not feel seen or welcomed, that is not right on its own. One thing that I would like to spotlight, in addition to the incredibly important, emotional impact of not seeing representation for our students, is that there is also a very tangible impact in terms of outcomes for students. We see this potentially in the dropout rate. We see this potentially, there's a really great case study of ethnic studies in the state of Arizona, which went through quite a dramatic story, that could be a whole other panel of how it was banned and now it's back. But what we saw through that case study really is that in places where there was ethnic studies, there was a immediate impact on the graduation rates and outcomes, and even things like college access and college retention for students. So I think we've heard so much about the moral impact and emotional impact, and there's also a tangible benefit in terms of these outcomes that we see with students as well. And I would like to see, as an educator, I think it's important to keep all three of those things in focus.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I so appreciate it. And Cedric, I don't know if you have anything to add, otherwise we will move to the next question.
I would say that the aspect of visibility is critically important for Indigenous peoples, particularly in the Commonwealth, given the relatively low numbers. Many residents treat Native peoples and Native populations essentially a rounding error. And that's a reason why something like the Indian Imprisonment and Exclusion Act can stay on the books from 1676 to 2004, essentially declaring Native people not to be able to be in the city of Boston or Mass Bay legally without an armed escort. So one of these things that would be directly addressed by this bill also finds and has very deep roots in terms of the erasure of Indigenous communities.
Thank you so much for that powerful perspective. The second leg of this four-legged table that I like to call it, of this legislation, is providing for professional development for teachers and counselors. And while we have you here, Cedric, would you like to speak to the importance of providing that and what it means substantively?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mona. Appropriate resource professional development opportunities are critical for teachers and counselors to best serve their students, our students. Our work at UMass Boston with K-12 educators via school districts, teacher training organizations, or community agencies have led to rich learning environments for us as faculty, as well as our fellow educators in the room with us. This legislation creates a mechanism for us to bring additional research and analysis to these teachers to enhance their already robust and significant skills. Teachers, educators have lots of intelligence. What they're short on is time and the resources to build and further engage what they want to bring to these spaces. We also bring as faculty our own sets of community connections, projects, academic networks, and experiences that new teachers in particular or counselors have not yet had the opportunity to develop.
So Speak, you actually brought up a concern that some people have brought up, which is that teachers, there's already too many requirements in their curriculum. There's no more room for additional classwork. And I would love to hear from either Paul or Jessica on this, both sort of from a university point of view and also from a public school point of view. Just real quickly, if you have a moment.
Well, I'm willing to respond. This notion that there's not enough room. There's always been room to talk about American history in terms of the white fundamental dominant society's notion of what American history is about. There's plenty of opportunity to talk about, for example, immigration from Europe or things like that. Immigration from Asia, not so much opportunity to talk about it. There's always been opportunity to talk about certain things. It's a question of how you center and make fundamental something from the very beginning and carry it through the curriculum. And that's what we want to do about the notion of ethnic studies. We don't want it to be something that's a separate part only of our curriculum. It's a fundamental part of American history. It's not something that's unique to Asian American history or Latino history or in the indigenous experience. It's endemic to all of us. So if we really truly want to study, as we say, we want to teach US history, let's talk about US history for all the people and all those who have influenced it. And particularly as a US history going forward, within a couple decades, America will be a majority non-white country, So when Aaron talks about the need to have diversity that speaks to the diversity of the population, how are we going to continue to argue we cannot make room for this reality that's so fundamental to the lived reality of the people who make up this country, and particularly the school children who are part of it?
Thank you so much, Paul. Jessica, from your perspective as a teacher.
Yep, I would like to add on with what Professor Watanabe is saying and point out that all too often, I very much empathize with, as a teacher, I know that pressure for time. I know what that crunch feels like. And so I want to absolutely validate that there is a grain of truth to that concern. With that said, as Professor Watanabe mentioned, with us becoming a quote unquote, minority country, which again could be a whole other discussion. I think about the fact that our job in public education is not just preparing folks for the workforce, as important as that skill is, but we're also raising up folks who are going to become members of an engaged democracy. We're not just raising people for the workforce, we're raising up people to be citizens. And part of being a citizen is being fully aware of, respectful of, and knowledgeable about the history and identity of all of the folks around you in our community. And if we really want to live up to this public trust and this idea of America that we love to uphold as this beacon of diversity, we need to show that in the way that our curriculum is structured. And as much as I want to validate and empathize with that time pressure, one of the things I really like about this commission is that they can also do a lot of this groundwork and provide recommendations and resources for us to not just add something in or cram something in, but fundamentally restructure parts of our curriculum, because I not only see it in the way students don't feel heard, I see it too in some of the glazed expressions that kids are picking up, that this isn't always truly representing them and their world. Kids are really smart. They tell us when something's not working for them, and I feel like we're being told that right now. And so it's our job as the adults in the room to figure that out.
Yes, and so I appreciate that perspective, particularly as teacher. Stay on, Jessica, because actually the next question is for you. And I definitely want to also circle back to Aaron on this joint perspective, which is about licensure. So as alluded to earlier by our speakers, we really don't have enough POC teachers. We just don't have enough persons of color in education. And one of the tenets of this bill is to look at licensure. Given that this is your field, I would appreciate if you'd shed some light on what that means, what that could look like, and how do we answer the concerns out there that somehow that would reduce the quality of teachers.
Sure. So I am not a statistician. However, I listen to the experts, and when I have consulted with this research and this evidence, what I have seen is that tests such as the MTEL, all too often when you sort of disaggregate, you see the way that folks of different races that are not often the norm in our classroom get screened out by this test. So what that tells me is there's not some magical, sorting mechanism. What this tells me is that all too often, the MTEL, which is the test for licensure in the state of Massachusetts, probably has intrinsic bias. And this is something that the commission needs to review. So that's point number one. Point number two is actually not a statistic, it's a story connected to this. I am not going to name this person because I wouldn't want to give too many identifying details, but a friend of mine actually who is Latina is very interested in education, wants to be an educator. We actually went through the same graduate program together. She happens to be an English learner. Her dream is to teach English learners. And so, all of these things are clicking together. And ironically, because she is an English learner, there are some subtle intricacies of grammar where it's not quite clicking with, I forget, there's one of the subject matter tests. But the fact of the matter is, ironically, this struggle that she has would actually make her an excellent teacher of English learners. I teach English learners. I happen to be monolingual. And so I have had to get out of my comfort zone and do a lot of research to figure out those moments where, a student may not, may have an error in their first language transponding to the second language. My friend is a natural, and unfortunately, because of the MTEL, she is being prevented from serving the kids of our state. And I'm sure, I hesitate sharing stories like that because there's always that naysayer who will say like, well, they can't pass this test, so da 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 da. I'm telling you that when we make those types of gatekeepers fundamental to the profession, we are leaving out and we are marginalizing people who could very well be serving the young people around us. And if people are worried about lowering standards, there are absolutely holistic ways in teacher preparation programs to make sure that those standards are being met. So this is really important to me, and I'm very curious to see if this bill passes, what the commission ultimately recommends, because we are too often gatekeeping folks who would really get a lot and would really deliver a lot in the classroom.
So thank you for sharing that perspective. I think it's wonderful that we want to diversify our education base, but right now we don't. And I would like for Aaron, I know it's a surprise question, Aaron, for you to give a little perspective on what it would mean to you to have more teachers of color, more diversity in the classroom. It wasn't so long ago that you were a student, you're a college student now, you're in the community. And would you just quickly speak to the impact of not having a diverse staff and not having, I think that's something that as painful as it is, we need to hear.
Absolutely. Thank you. I want to say from my own experience, and as you said, I'm fairly new out of high school. Graduating from a public high school, I can attest like the state of our homogenous school systems. To walk into the doors of Medford High daily and see no adult or teacher or administrator who looked like me furthered the belief inside of me that African-American and Black folks can do no more than rap or dribble a basketball. That, this might seem like a bit of an exaggerated outlook, but for a 15, 16-year-old who identifies as biracial, this was all that I really could see. Now, imagine having that outlook as you walk into history class, freshman through senior year, for example, and learn next to nothing about BIPOCs or the countless things they have done to leave a lasting effect on our country or the world. any moment where there was an African-American, for my own experience, from an African-American or Black person's, a poet or an author, a musician, film producer, any moment where we could learn about those individuals, it was skipped over in a class or two while we spent months on Of Mice and Men and The Great Gatsby, which are great pieces of literature in their own right, but reading Things Fall Apart by Nigerian author Chinua Achebe in the last month of senior year doesn't make up for the near 4 years of the, gracious white impact on our nation. I think that, especially for me, I was picked on in my senior class as being someone who is half Nigerian, as being the token Black person in class, to speak to the Nigerian experience and culture as if I am to know it through and through, and I think that me, as someone who's grown up, predominantly in a white neighborhood before I moved to Medford, and with a white parent, I really just, lived into my whiteness because it seemed easier than to try to identify with the teachers who didn't look like me, right? So I just tried to operate and act as if someone I was not. And so for students who don't get that luxury, or that, devoid luxury of operating a different way than they may be, it really, again, can be extremely harmful, because you look at someone who you're supposed to look up to, who's supposed to be teaching you, educating you, leading you to the next phase of your life, and they don't understand every aspect of you because they can't.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for giving much
Can
to that.
Can I mention, Mona, a way in which I think a diverse curriculum will add to a diverse workforce? We always think of it the other way around. We're going to create a diverse workforce and they're going to come in and change the curriculum. If we had a curriculum that was meaningful to students like Aaron, and that we see they're going to want to get into teaching, but if they have to teach the kind of material that they, nobody's want to teach us material if it doesn't speak to their lived reality. If it does, they're going to be attracted to it. This is a difference, I think. I hate to speak generally, but being non-white and being white in American society means, for many people who are of color, including students, the part of their identity of being non-white is either first or second in terms of the way they view the world. And it's the way they view the world, they view curriculum, they view everything. And if they don't see themselves in the content that they're being engaged in class, then they say to themselves, why would I want to become a teacher and teach this stuff that is not relevant to my reality and the reality of people around me? If we can make our curriculum more meaningful and real, I think it'll bring more people into the classroom who'll be excited about teaching this material, not in some respects trying to be offended by it, or perhaps even being turned off by it, or even have to be tried in a guerrilla fashion to be opposed to it.
So that leads really to my next question, and you're on deck, Paul, which is, this legislation, the fourth leg of this table, is that it articulates the affirmative need to develop age-appropriate pedagogy to decolonize the classroom, incorporating not only ethnic studies, but racial justice. So Paul, we would love your perspective on the importance of these topics being taught at all grade levels. Please give perspectives to why this is beneficial for all students. I think someone said, well, this will be particularly important for students of color, but I don't think that's true. I think it's important for everyone to get a fair and honest and non-distorted education. And they use the term critical approach. So please expand on all of that. In a very short amount of time, I'm getting pings that we should wrap up, but I have to hear this answer. I hope the audience can be a little flexible. Thanks.
Well, let me say just in general, this is the beauty behind the idea of creating a commission. You've talked about a number of things, about doing an anti-racist curriculum, about ethnic studies, about developing issues that focus on units that focus on decolonizing, et cetera. This is where the commission is going to have to give us some guidance, because we're not going to be able to create all of this tomorrow, and we shouldn't. We should train people. We should do as Cedric said, we got to make sure that the people are trained to do this. There's a lot of efforts in a lot of states and other places to immediately respond and say we need to mandate ethnic studies. But you should not mandate anything without making sure people have the proper training to be able to do that. And that means to be very deliberate and careful about how you do this work. And so the commission, I think the value of it is going to be able to see how we should implement this stuff, whether we should do it by pilot programs rather than do it en masse as a mandate that gets applied generally. And we should see what kind of training and materials and so forth work. That's the value of the commission approach. And that's why I really think that that's a proper way to really implement and look at this broad range of possible areas in which we could pursue in terms of curriculum. and in terms of trying to recruit diversified faculty, et cetera. That's really the mandate of the commission.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I feel like every one of you could really, we need actually, we should let the audience know that we're going to have not just one of these, we're going to have several more of these, because I think it's clear that there's a lot to cover, and also there's a lot to say and a lot to learn. So I see our legislators have joined us, and so we're going to make this a rapid fire round. Whoever would like to raise their hand to answer this question, get ready to go. What's the likelihood of passage of this bill? Who would like to take that on? Anyone? Raise your hand. Legislators particularly. Oh, I thought everyone was saying so much.
I'll just say,
jump in.
Senator Lewis, who drafted the bill, will have the closing statement on this. I think that with strong advocacy, we have a good chance of getting it passed. I think addressing some of the language issues might be a challenge, some that have been raised in the chat and some that haven't, and making sure that we land with the language that's actionable and that is evaluatable and that we can follow up on and make sure that it's working and revisit and course correct in the future. I think if we look at cases happening in other parts of the country, it underscores for us the importance of making sure that what we pass provides a framework for coming back and reevaluating the effectiveness of the bill.
Fantastic. And also, next person who answers on what are some present and potential obstacles to the passage of this legislation? Senator Lewis, would you like to take that on?
Sure. Well, let me say first that this was an amazing forum tonight, and thank you everybody for participating. And what gives me optimism is we have a great team, working on this with Representative Elegardo and Oderhoven and Senator Eldridge and many of our wonderful colleagues who are supportive, and then of course all of the advocates. But we do have an uphill battle here. It's a new bill, so that's always a challenge. We've got a lot of education to do with legislators. That's where all of you come in, as Representative Elegardo explained, by reaching out to your rep, your senator, meeting with them, ideally in person, and having these direct conversations. And, this is a fairly challenging area. I don't know how many of you have followed California and what's happened there over the last few years. It's been very fraught. So we've tried to learn from that experience in California and other states in how we've drafted this bill. It's not actually a mandate, which would be very difficult to get passed, to mandate ethnic studies, for example, to be taught in.
I think it's more than the one that.
So I think we've got a good approach. We've got a great team, but we've got, our work is cut out for us, really, where, everybody comes in that's with us tonight and speaking to your colleagues, friends, neighbors, to build, continue to build awareness, education, support. That's what's going to get us ultimately across the line.
Thank you so much, Senator Lewis. And so this is open to all the panel, this next question, which is not about us without us. And so that's an important tenet, both from the expert, for sort of our resident experts here and our legislators. Do you feel that this legislation will really address this concern? Communities of color often hear that, that we take your concern seriously, we understand what's happening, but the truth is, unless you listen, unless you are in these communities, sometimes it's hard to tell. What do you feel about this legislation ensures not about us without us? Would anybody like to take that on?
I'm happy to say something, and just such an honor to be part of this forum is, I think in Senator Lewis, highlighted is that this bill really came, in the beginning stages from his constituents, a significant number of Asian American leaders, and now we've added all voices of color to the bill, and Senator Lewis mentioning, looking at the history of how a similar bill made its way in California. So I think that voices of color, including legislators of color, are part of this. Obviously, you have Representative Elegardo, Representative Eiderhaven that are the lead House sponsors. And so I think you already have that. And I think what I would say is that, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, is that, there are so many pieces of legislation, so many tools that we need to attack racism. And I think that the twin injustices of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd and other Black civilians, especially in 2020, really have caused the legislature to look through virtually every piece of legislation, every commission, through that racial equity lens. And hopefully, more broadly, people of color across the state are engaging with their elected officials who, hey, more often than not are white, but are educating us, for me as a white legislator, about the need to tackle this in the education area as well. So I think voices are being heard. We absolutely need more leaders of color to have a seat at the table, but I think that's changing too, and hopefully will change next year as well in an exciting election year.
Speaking of building bridges, how do we build bridges? An audience question, an important one. How do we build bridges among rural, urban, and suburban communities on these issues? It's a tough one. Anybody would like to take that on? I know. Well, we can say that for the next forum. That's actually a question that might take just a little bit more than the non-existent time that we have left. But I would like to thank all of you and certainly our very patient attendees who have listened to the bulk of this presentation. And we hope that this is the first of many presentations on this very important piece of legislation. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dawn.
Hello, thanks, Mona. And on behalf of our CARE Coalition, I would like to thank Senator Eldridge for hosting this very momentful forum, and also like to thank the legislator, candidates, teachers, students, and everyone for joining tonight's event. We really appreciate your time and your support of these two very important bills, which will lead to a very fundamental change towards education equities. I personally wish my children had grown up in the AB school system, learning about Asian and other ethnic histories. This is a very crucial moment for us to support the next generation to create a more inclusive, socially just society. Here is the call to actions. And your voice are very important. Please let your legislature know this bill matters to you. We need their co-sponsorship and active support on the bill. The easiest way to reach out to your legislator is to use an Action Network link provided in the chat. Just fill in your name and address. It will take only a few minutes. We will also send this link, among other actions, for you in email after webinars. Please follow us in our Facebook page, Instagram, and Twitter for frequent updates and more events. If you would like to start a similar forum event in your district or group, we are here to help. We also welcome endorsement from your group, your school committees, and your town officers. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us. Have a very great summer.
Hi, could I ask the legislators and the panelists and to stay for a group picture? If you could turn on your video.
Olivia, Lex.
Yeah, let me see.
Shaw, you need to turn on your video.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Everybody, please
Mona?
turn on your video.
So if everybody can, organizer,
Mona.
speakers.
Oh,
guys-
sorry.
The host has to turn on the video.
I don't know why I keep losing my video.
Yeah,
Here it
I'm
is.
having a tough time myself, sorry. Let me view in.
Olivia, Olivia, are you still with us?
Oh, I got a back gallery view. All right, so we have, oh yes, we have a huge team here. This is great. I'm sorry, I'm sure. So I want to take a few pictures. We are really, we're blessed to have a lot of very enthusiastic, supporters, activists, sponsors. And so is Ming here? Can you help us with a picture, Ming, or I'll do it?
Got a couple of pictures, but I'm worried that we keep missing people because they keep moving around.
All
So
right.
it took
Yeah.
two-
Well, if you guys just stay still, have a smile, and there'll be people taking pictures for a few seconds, and then I think we'll have a wrap up, and we will send out meeting minutes and follow-on action items later to everyone. Okay. And I want to thank you.
I want to especially thank everyone who took the time to organize. There were a lot of people behind the scenes, and certainly everyone who participated. This has been a really meaningful experience, and I would particularly like to thank Representative, I hope I'm saying it right, Elegardo, for being so open about that story. That story is many of our stories, and I hope we can do better for the future generations. That's my story, probably my kid's story. I hope we can do better for future generations. Thank you.
Many thanks to Shaw, Yang, and Mana Roy, and Vivian Sang, Don, and Huan. They've just been, and Hua and Ming, been just working around the clock. And Dr. Kim Chuang in the chat, answering the Q&As and whatnot. And many thanks to everybody. And of course, our legislators who really made this possible by championing the bill.
You made this possible. You made this possible by
Yes.
bringing everyone.
Maya is just absolutely amazing.
Yes, she made this possible. The rest of us are just
Co-signing, Maya's amazing.
Yes, she is amazing.
This is a great team.
I'm leaving. Have a good night, everybody.
Yes.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.